Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books, and today I'm doing yet another end of the year 2022 kind of wrap-up video type of thing. And today I'm going to be doing a ranking for you, and this is going to be my least favorite and my most disappointing books that I read in 2022. So I have 6 books here that I'm going to be talking about. I couldn't narrow it down to 5. There was, the couple at the bottom of my list I didn't really feel like choosing between, so it's going to be 6 books. And before I start, there are a couple of points I want to make. First of all, these are not books that released in 2022 that disappointed me. These are just books that I read in 2022, the ones that I would consider my least favorites. And likewise, when I do my favorites list, these are just books that I read in 2022. They are not necessarily 2022 releases, and in fact, none of these are 2022 releases. And also, just because I have a book on this list doesn't mean I necessarily think it's bad or think that it had no redeeming qualities. I will talk about each one individually and why I consider it one of my least favorite books that I read this year. But just because it's on this list doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad book, or that I didn't enjoy any of it, because in the case of several of these, there were parts that I enjoyed. They're just the ones that, for me, didn't quite work. So starting off at the bottom, at number 6, the least disappointing, least bad, whatever, book that I read this year is actually one that I don't think is that terrible. It was just, for me, kind of mediocre, and that's kind of the case for the next couple of spots as well. And unfortunately, that is Dune by Frank Herbert. This is, of course, a classic science fiction book that many people love, and I can see why. I enjoyed the world building immensely. I thought the world building in this book was really good. The characters, I thought, were, at least at times, kind of interesting. There was some interesting political stuff going on. This, in the first part of the book at least, kind of reminded me of A Song of Ice and Fire, which, granted, that series wasn't written until long after this book came out, but it kind of gave me that similar sort of vibe to it. And I did enjoy, like, the first half of this book a decent amount. It wasn't necessarily, like, a 10 out of 10 or anything for me when I was going through the first half, but I was enjoying it. And for some reason, the rest of the book, the second half or so, or maybe even the last third, just completely lost me for some reason. I just wasn't getting into the plot or anything like that. It just didn't really keep me invested. And I can't really point to any particular reason why that is. It just, for some reason, didn't really grab me. So as much as I hate to say it, because I went into this book really wanting to love it because of how well-liked it is within the sci-fi community, within the wider reading community, all of that stuff. I wanted to really like it, but ultimately it just kind of fell a little bit flat for me, but it did still have some good stuff, and I can see why people love it as much as they do. It just didn't quite do it for me. Next one up at number 5 is going to be a Star Wars novel, the only Star Wars novel on this list, and that is Tarkin by James Lucino. This one, again, I went into it really wanting to like it. I'm not, a crazy huge fan of Tarkin or anything, but he is a character that I was interested in learning more about, and I think that is what this book does do best. If you are going into this book really wanting to learn more about Tarkin and you're super into Tarkin, this will probably scratch that itch for you, and I think that's what this book does really well. Unfortunately, that's about the only thing in this book that I really felt was all that noteworthy. The plot of this book did not particularly interest me, and a lot of the stuff that wasn't about Tarkin and how he developed into the character who he is, and I did enjoy his interactions with Darth Vader as well, but just generally, everything else about it just didn't grab me. The plot was just really forgettable, to the point where I could barely tell you anything that happens in this book. And overall, I just felt like this was a pretty weak book for Star Wars. I have enjoyed the majority of Star Wars books that I have read, both in the canon as well as the EU. Certainly there have been some duds, and unfortunately, this is one of them for me. Next is yet another classic, well-loved author and book not really series, but a world that is very much beloved, and one that I also love, but unfortunately this entry just did not do it for me. And that is Unfinished Tales by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now this one I think I can point to exactly why it didn't really do it for me. And that's, I think, mainly because these are not kind of typical narratives. And this is just made up of a bunch of unfinished stories that are all relatively short, and they're not finished, and they are not always necessarily a typical narrative structure like something like The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. And while I definitely appreciate this book for enhancing the lore and adding more to the world of Middle-earth and all that stuff, and there were certainly some tidbits of story in here that I did enjoy, it just overall didn't really do much for me. However, I do really enjoy Tolkien's other work. Like I said, Hobbit and Lord of the Rings I really enjoy, and even the Silmarillion, while not quite doing it for me to the extent of those, and in fact, I almost considered putting it on this list because of that. Even that, I still do enjoy a decent chunk of, so I'm definitely going to be checking out more of Tolkien's work in the future. This, unfortunately, was just a dud for me. Moving on to number 3, we have the first entry in a series that I started. It's technically the first entry in the series, but there are other books within the world, but this is the first book in the actual main series, which is the first book of The Witcher, which is Blood of Elves. I really enjoyed the 2 short story collections, which are Sword of Destiny and The Last Wish, which most people recommend that you read before reading the main series, which is something that I would agree with. I think they do a good job of establishing the world and all that stuff, establishing the characters. So I would recommend reading those before you read the main series, and so that's what I did, and I really enjoyed those. I thought that the short stories were really enjoyable, and I enjoyed the characters and all that stuff. And for some reason, this book just didn't do it for me. I just couldn't get into the plot that much. I still enjoyed the characters and the character interactions, and ultimately that's the thing that I think I enjoy the most about The Witcher, is the characters and their interactions and all of that stuff. But the storyline here and all of that kind of stuff just didn't really hook me. And this is one that just didn't really interest me that much. Thankfully, I have read books 2 and 3 in the main series. I still have not read 4 and 5. But thankfully, I do think the series so far has gotten better with each entry. But unfortunately, it just had a weak start for me. Next, at number 2, I have a short story collection, actually, and that is The Yellow Sign and Other Stories by Robert W. Chambers. This is a short story collection that I got as a part of a box set, which included Lovecraft, as well as some other contemporary authors and other authors who inspired him. I have a review of that on the channel if you're interested, but this was a part of that, and this was by far my least favorite out of the 5 books that were included in that set. This one just really did not do it for me. There are about a dozen short stories in here, and honestly, there's only maybe 2 or 3 that I really enjoyed. And I think a part of that, first of all, is that there are not just horror stories in here. There's also some other works of fiction in here that are not like horror or cosmic horror or whatever that I kind of more expected this to be. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, if a person wants to write other stuff than horror, even though they are well known for horror, that is totally fine. But it is not what I wanted out of this short story collection, and I just did not find those stories very interesting. And even some of the horror stories that were in here just did not do it for me. But again, there was some good stuff in here. I really enjoyed In the Court of the Dragon, and then The Yellow Sign, as well as The Mask, were also decent short stories. But outside of those 3, I can't really think of any that really stood out to me as even all that great. Most of them for me just were either mediocre or I just flat out did not really like them. So unfortunately, this is going to be my second most disappointing book that I read this year. And finally, my number 1 least favorite book that I read in 2022 is one that I don't have a physical copy of, because it is one that I borrowed from somebody, and that is the fourth entry in the A Song of Ice and Fire series by George R. R. Martin, titled A Feast for Crows. This one, to me, I haven't reviewed it on my channel, but I do have a review on my Instagram and on my Goodreads. And in that review, I stated that for me, this was just a very nothing book. Out of all of the books on this list, this is the one that I just found the most forgettable, the one that just really, I can't point to really anything in it that I found super redeeming. I mean, there are a couple of characters in it that have their POV chapters that I did enjoy a little bit, and there are characters that I have enjoyed in other entries in the series, like Arya and Samwell and Sansa. You know, I enjoy those characters, and they were in this book, but they got very minimal attention compared to many other characters like Cersei and Jaime, who are characters that I am just not as interested in. And ultimately, this book, for me, I was just reading it and I was bored for most of it, which, you know, something like Blood of Elves, for example, or some of the stories in the Yellow Sign did have that for me, but I, at least in Blood of Elves, really enjoyed the characters and their interactions. In the Yellow Sign, I really enjoyed a few of the short stories. In A Feast for Crows, there just wasn't really anything for me to latch onto as far as this is really enjoyable for me. Most of it was just not that interesting. And I hate to say it because I've really enjoyed this series up until this point. I loved the first two books. I loved a decent chunk of the third book. I didn't love all of it, but I did enjoy quite a bit of it. And I am currently, I just started the fifth book, and so far I am enjoying it more than the fourth book in its entirety, and I've only read, I think, 3 chapters of the fifth book. So it's really unfortunate because I do really enjoy this series, but unfortunately, A Feast for Crows just did not do anything for me really at all. And that is pretty much it for this video, so let me know down in the comments what you think of any of these books. If you have read them, do you also think they were kind of disappointing, or did you maybe really enjoy some of these? Let me know down in the comments, and look forward to my best of the year list, which I hope to be getting out soon as well. And that will probably be coming within the next couple weeks, assuming I get the chance to record it, and I assume I will, but, you know, sometimes life happens, so I may not get the chance to do that until a little bit later, but hopefully that will be out within the next week or two. But anyways, that is pretty much it for today, so thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time.